The house was too quiet when I stepped in. Linda's car wasn't in the driveway, but there was a strange black SUV parked just down the street. Something felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. I wasn't the kind of man who ignored his instincts. 34 years of marriage had taught me that silence could hide all kinds of sins. Walking through the hall, I noticed her shoes kicked off by the staircase, too casual for someone who wasn't supposed to be home. My eyes narrowed. My grip tightened around my briefcase as I moved upstairs, the faintest trace of an unfamiliar cologne hitting me halfway up. The bedroom door was cracked open, and muffled laughter spilled out. A man's laugh. I shoved the door open with a sharp kick, sending it slamming against the wall. Inside, Linda was sprawled across our bed, barely covered, while a younger man scrambled to grab his pants off the floor. His face turned pale the second he saw me. "What the hell?" I said, my voice low, dangerous. Linda gasped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The kid, because that's all he was to me, some wannabe stud with more ego than sense, held up his hands like I was a cop about to pull a gun. "Hey, man," he stammered. I didn't let him finish. "Didn't mean what?" I snapped, stepping toward him. "Didn't mean to sneak into another man's house and crawl into his bed? Didn't mean to touch what doesn't belong to you?" "Michael, stop!" Linda cried, scrambling off the bed. "It's not what it looks like." I turned to her, eyes like steel. "Shut your mouth. You'll speak when I say you can." She froze, trembling as I looked back at the kid. He was trying to step into his pants, shaking so hard he could barely pull them up. "You think you can waltz in here, disrespect me in my own house, and leave on your own 2 feet?" I asked, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. I didn't wait for his answer. My eyes landed on the wooden baseball bat propped in the corner of the room. Linda had bought it years ago as some decoration, never imagining it would one day be used for justice. Grabbing the bat, I swung it over my shoulder and stared the kid down. "You've got 2 options," I said coldly. "Go out the door, or I'll throw you out the window." The kid's eyes darted to the open window, panic setting in. Wait," he stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean." "I don't care what you meant." My voice dropped an octave, heavy with finality. He turned to Linda, desperation on his face. "Help me out here. Don't even look at her," I roared, slamming the bat into the floor for emphasis. "You're not walking out of this room unless you jump. Decide." He didn't need to be told twice. Clutching his pants to his waist, he bolted for the window. With one last panicked look over his shoulder, he climbed onto the sill and leapt. I heard him hit the bushes below, followed by the sound of scrambling footsteps as he ran for his life. Linda started sobbing, sinking to her knees. "Michael, I'm so sorry. Please let me explain." "Explain?" I said, rounding on her. I pointed the bat at her like a judge delivering a sentence. "The only thing you'll explain is why you're still here when I told you to shut your mouth." She flinched, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my tone like ice. "You dragged some gutter rat into my house, into my bed, and you want to play it off like nothing?" She tried to crawl toward me, but I stepped back, raising the bat slightly. "Don't come closer. I'll tell you this once, Linda, you've got 10 minutes to pack a bag and get the hell out. If you're still here when I come back, you'll follow your boyfriend out the window." Her sobs turned into desperate gasps, but I didn't care. She made her choice. Now she'd live with it. I walked out of the room, leaving her on the floor, and slammed the door behind me. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about respect, the kind I wouldn't let anyone, not even her, take from me again. I stood in the living room, my hands gripping the bat as I stared out the window. The kid was long gone, but the bushes below bore the evidence of his graceless escape. The silence of the house now felt more like a battlefield after the dust had settled. Linda's sobs filtered down from upstairs, a pathetic soundtrack to her betrayal. I didn't move. I needed to think, to plan my next steps. Emotions were a weakness, and I had no intention of letting mine cloud my judgment. This wasn't just about anger, it was about control, about ensuring that no one could pull this kind of disrespect again. I turned and walked back upstairs, my footsteps deliberate and heavy. The bedroom door was still open, and there she was, sitting on the edge of the bed with her face buried in her hands. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes swollen and red. "Michael, please," she began, her voice trembling. "Let me explain. It was a mistake, I swear. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my tone sharp. I pointed the bat at her. "You brought some punk into my house, into my bed, and you expect me to believe it didn't mean anything? Do I look that stupid to you?" Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words. I didn't give her the chance. "Get up," I barked. She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the bat. "Now." She stumbled to her feet, clutching the sheet around her like it could protect her from the consequences of her actions. "You think I'm going to sit here and listen to your excuses?" I asked, stepping closer. "You think you can worm your way out of this with some fake tears and a sob story about how it just happened? Michael, please, just listen to me." "Shut your mouth," I snapped, cutting her off. "You don't speak unless I tell you to. You gave up your right to explain the second you let that little rat into my house." Her tears were flowing freely now, but I felt nothing. Sympathy was for fools, and I wasn't about to be one of them. "You've got one chance to save whatever shred of dignity you have left," I said, my voice cold. "Pack your things, get out, and don't come back. If you're still here in 10 minutes, I'll make sure the cops escort you out." Her hands tightened around the sheet. "Please, Michael," she whispered. "We've been together for so long. Don't throw it all away over one mistake. I love you." "Love?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You call this love? Dragging someone into my bed and laughing with him like I'm some joke?" She stepped closer, reaching out like she thought she could touch me and make me forget everything. I stepped back, raising the bat slightly. "Don't," I warned. "You don't get to come near me, not after this. You're lucky I haven't already thrown your things out the window along with him." Her expression crumbled, but I didn't care. She had made her choice. Now it was my turn. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Linda?" I asked, lowering the bat but keeping my grip firm. "I built everything in this house, every brick, every dollar, every piece of respect people have for this family. And you? You just took it for granted, like it was yours to waste." "Michael, Enough," I snapped. "You done talking. Get your things and go." She froze, staring at me like she couldn't believe this was happening. I didn't move, didn't flinch. "You have 5 minutes now," I said, my voice low and steady. "And if you're not out by then, I'll call every single one of our friends, our kids, and your precious yoga group and tell them exactly why you're not welcome here anymore. Do you understand me?" She nodded slowly, her tears still falling. Without another word, she turned and began gathering her clothes, stuffing them haphazardly into a bag. I watched her the entire time, making sure she didn't try anything. When she was done, she stood by the door, clutching the bag like it was her lifeline. She looked at me one last time, her eyes pleading. "Michael, please. Don't do this. We can fix it. We can go to counseling, talk things through. I'll do anything." I stepped closer, towering over her. "The time for fixing things was before you opened your legs for someone else. Now, there's nothing left to fix. Her lip quivered, but I didn't stop. You've lost this house, this life, and me. Go crawl back to your little boyfriend and see how far that gets you. But don't you dare step foot on my property again. If I see you near this house, I'll have a restraining order so fast your head will spin. Are we clear? She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. I opened the door and motioned for her to leave. She walked out, her head down, and I slammed the door behind her. For the first time that evening, the house felt quiet again, not the silence of betrayal, but the kind that comes after a storm has passed. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But for now, the first step was complete. She was out, and this was my house again. The house was quiet again, but this wasn't over. Linda thought she could walk out of here and leave me to pick up the pieces? She had no idea what was coming. As for that smug bastard who ran out my window half-dressed, his day of reckoning was already in motion. I sat down at the dining table, opened Linda's laptop, and started digging. Her email account was still logged in, a careless mistake, but not surprising for someone so used to hiding behind lies. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There it was, a trail of emails and messages that spelled out every sordid detail. His name was Brian Keller. 32. A project manager at some second-rate construction firm. Married. Married. That was rich. A married man sneaking around with my wife in the house I built with my bare hands. It didn't stop there. The messages between them revealed a series of planned meetups, complete with times, dates, and places. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, my anger now a cold, calculated force. This wasn't just about taking Linda down anymore. This was about dismantling everything Brian held dear. I wrote down his address, another gift from their digital correspondence, and closed the laptop. Next, I logged into our shared bank account. Linda wouldn't be dipping her hands into my finances anytime soon. I transferred everything to a private account I'd opened years ago, just in case. Every penny, gone. Her credit cards? Cancelled with a few quick clicks. As for the house, that was already mine. I'd seen to it years ago when I refinanced the mortgage in my name alone. She wouldn't be able to touch a single brick of it. By the time I finished, Linda was financially neutered. If she thought she'd use my hard-earned money to rebuild her life after this, she was in for a rude awakening. I called my lawyer, Tom. He was a shark, the kind of man who didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need to file for divorce, I said, my voice sharp. Adultery. I want her out of my life, and I want her to leave with nothing. Tom chuckled darkly. Sounds like you've got everything under control. Got proof? Plenty, I replied. Photos, emails. You'll have everything by tomorrow. Good, he said. I'll start the paperwork. Anything else? Yes, I said, my tone hardening. I want to make sure she can't come back. If there's a way to keep her off my property permanently, I want it done. Consider it handled. I hung up, my next move already clear. The next morning, I drove to Brian's house. It was a modest place in a bland suburban neighborhood, the kind of cookie-cutter life he clearly couldn't handle. I parked a block away, walked to his door, and rang the bell. When he opened it, his face turned ghostly pale. He recognized me instantly. Brian Keller, I said, my voice as calm as it was dangerous. Yeah, he stammered, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. I handed him an envelope. Inside were the pictures I'd taken of him and Linda, along with screenshots of their emails and texts. This is everything your wife needs to see, I said, keeping my tone flat. Unless, of course, you'd rather listen to what I have to say. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. What do you want? Here's how this works, I said, stepping closer. You going to quit your job? Effective immediately. You going to tell your wife why you doing it, and then you going to disappear. If I ever see your face again, anywhere near me, my family, or anyone I know, I'll make sure everyone you care about gets this package. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. Then he looked down at the envelope in his hands and seemed to deflate. You can't do this, he whispered. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a cold growl. I already did. You brought this on yourself. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind about letting you walk away. I turned and walked back to my car without another word. When I got home, the house was still and quiet, just the way I liked it. I poured myself a drink and sat in my office, reviewing everything I'd set in motion. Linda was gone. Brian was broken. And I wasn't done yet. Next, I'd make sure everyone Linda thought she could rely on knew exactly what she'd done. Her friends, her yoga group, even our children, they'd all see her for what she really was. This wasn't just about vengeance. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my house, and my life. Linda and Brian thought they could walk over me, but they'd forgotten who they were dealing with. I wasn't just fighting back, I was erasing them from my world. The house was quiet, but I wasn't done. Linda thought she could walk out with nothing but her clothes and some hollow apologies, but her humiliation was just beginning. The world she had taken for granted, the people she thought she could manipulate, were about to see her for who she truly was. I poured myself another whiskey, letting the amber liquid warm me as I thought about my next move. It wasn't enough to take away her financial safety net. It wasn't enough to make her lover crawl back into whatever hole he came from. No, Linda had built her life on lies, and now I was going to tear it apart. The first call I made was to Samantha. She'd been Linda's best friend for over a decade, a loud, nosy woman who thrived on gossip. If Linda thought she could count on her loyalty, she was sorely mistaken. People like Samantha loved a scandal, and I had one tailor-made just for her. Samantha, it's Michael, I said when she picked up. Her tone was wary. Michael? Is everything okay? Not really, I replied. I thought you should know something about Linda. It's going to come out eventually, so better you hear it from me. There was a pause on the line. I could feel her curiosity burning through the phone. What are you talking about? I told her everything. The affair. The lover. The pictures. I painted a vivid picture of betrayal, leaving just enough gaps to make her imagination fill in the worst details. By the time I was done, she was practically buzzing with indignation. She did what? Samantha nearly shouted. After all these years? You didn't hear it from me, I said, my voice calm. But I thought you deserved to know. I'm sure the others in her yoga group would want to hear it too. You know how close they all are. Samantha promised she wouldn't say a word about where she got the information, but I knew better. Within hours, Linda's little social circle would be on fire with rumors, and she'd be the pariah of their suburban tea parties. My next move was more personal. I called Emily, a daughter. She was the youngest, smart, determined, and fiercely loyal. Out of everyone, this part would hurt the most. But Linda had forced my hand. Dad? Emily answered, her voice warm as always. Hi, sweetheart, I said. For a moment, my resolve wavered, but I pushed through. I need to tell you something about your mother. It's not easy, but you deserve the truth. By the time I finished explaining, Emily was silent. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, as she processed what I'd said. She cheated on you, she finally asked, her voice cold. Yes, I replied. In our house. With some married man. Jesus Christ, she muttered. Have you talked to David? David was my son, a more reserved man than Emily but no less protective of his family. Not yet, I said. But I will. Emily sighed. Do you need me to come over? No, I said firmly. I've got it handled. But I thought you should know. I'm filing for divorce, and I don't want her back in this house. Ever. Good, she said, her voice sharp. She doesn't deserve to step foot in there again. After hanging up, I felt a weight lift. Telling the kids was the hardest part, but it was necessary. They needed to see the truth, not some version of events Linda would try to spin in her favor. Now, it was time for the final act of the day. I went to my office, pulled out a folder of documents, and started typing an email. Attached were the pictures of Linda and Brian, along with the messages I'd saved from her laptop. The email was addressed to Linda's yoga group, her close friends, and a handful of her work colleagues, anyone she valued enough to try and hide this from. The subject line read, The truth about Linda. I kept the email short and factual, leaving no room for doubt. Attached are documents proving Linda West's affair with a married man. This behavior took place in my home during our marriage. I felt it was important for those close to her to know the truth. I stared at that send button for a moment, then pressed it without hesitation. Sitting back in my chair, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Linda had made her choices, and now she'd face the consequences. By the next morning, the fallout was already beginning. Emily called me, furious after hearing from some of Linda's friends who had received the email. She's trying to spin it like you're the bad guy, she said. She's telling people you're controlling and that this was some kind of cry for help. I laughed darkly. Of course she is. Let her try. The truth is on my side. That evening, I checked the local community forums, where the rumors had already spread like wildfire. Linda's reputation was in shreds. Samantha had done her job well, and the email had only poured gasoline on the fire. As I poured another drink, I allowed myself a rare smile. Linda thought she could destroy me, but now she was the one who had nothing left. No friends, no money, no respect. And I wasn't done yet. Tomorrow, I'd focus on Brian. The fallout from my email hit harder and faster than even I anticipated. By the next morning, my phone was blowing up with messages from people I barely knew, neighbors, old friends, and even distant family members. Everyone wanted to confirm the same thing. Was it true? Had Linda really been cheating on me? I ignored most of the calls, letting them go to voicemail. My work wasn't done, and I didn't have time for gossip. My focus now was Brian Keller. He was just as guilty as Linda, and he wasn't going to walk away unscathed. After finishing my coffee, I pulled up the folder where I'd saved all of Brian's information. His address, workplace, and even details about his wife, Jessica. Linda wasn't the only one who deserved to face the consequences of her actions. Jessica had a right to know who her husband really was. I drove across town to Brian's office, a glassy building in the middle of the business district. Parking across the street, I watched as employees streamed into the building, coffee cups in hand and heads down. It wasn't hard to spot him. Brian walked in a little after 9, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. I waited until he was inside before following. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "Not exactly," I said, matching her tone. "I just need to drop something off for Brian Keller." "It's important." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You can leave it here, and I'll make sure he gets it." I handed her a sealed envelope. Inside were the same photos and emails I'd sent to Linda's yoga group, along with a personal note. To Brian Keller. I thought it was only fair to share these with your coworkers. It's important they know the kind of man they're working with. Sincerely, Michael West. Walking out of the building, I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. This was just the start. When I got back home, I called Jessica. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. She picked up on the second ring. Hello? Her voice was calm, pleasant, completely unaware of the storm about to hit her. Jessica Keller? I asked, keeping my tone measured. Yes, who's this? This is Michael West. I believe we have something in common, your husband. There was a pause on the line, and I could hear her breathing change. What are you talking about? I didn't waste time. Your husband has been having an affair with my wife. I have evidence, and I thought you should know. For the next few minutes, I explained everything. The messages, the meetups, the pictures. I kept my tone factual, emotionless, letting the details speak for themselves. By the time I finished, Jessica was silent. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. Do you have proof? I do, I said. I can send you everything. She hesitated but eventually agreed. After I hung up, I forwarded her the same files I'd sent to Brian's office. If she didn't already know the truth, she did now. Later that afternoon, my lawyer called. Michael, Tom said, his tone brisk. I've got everything I need to move forward. The divorce paperwork is almost ready. Adultery cases are messy, but with what you've given me, Linda doesn't have a leg to stand on. Good, I said. What about the house? I don't want her coming back. That's already handled, he replied. With her name off the mortgage and the restraining order in place, she won't be able to step foot on your property without risking arrest. And the assets? She'll fight for them, Tom said. But given the circumstances, the courts will likely side with you. She won't walk away with much. I nodded, satisfied. Make it happen. When I hung up, I felt a weight lift. The legal side of things was under control, but there was still work to be done. That evening, I called Emily and David. It was time to update them. Hey, Dad, Emily answered. Hi, sweetheart. Is David there with you? Yeah, we're both here, she said. What's going on? I wanted to let you know I've started the divorce process, I said. It's moving quickly. Your mom's not going to have access to the house or the accounts anymore. There was a pause, then David spoke. Good, he said simply. Emily sighed. She's already called me, you know. She's trying to make herself the victim, saying you're overreacting. I laughed darkly. Of course she is. That's what people like her do. But you both know the truth now, and that's all that matters. David was quiet for a moment before he said, let us know if you need anything. We've got your back. I appreciate it, I said. But I've got everything under control. When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair, letting the day's events replay in my mind. Brian's career was about to go up in flames. Jessica now knew the truth about her husband. Linda had no money, no home, and no one to turn to. This wasn't just revenge. It was a reset. A chance to take back my life and make sure no one ever disrespected me again. I poured another drink and raised it to the empty room. To starting over, I said, the words heavy with finality. Tomorrow, I'd set my sights on the next step. But for tonight, I could rest easy knowing I'd done what needed to be done. The next morning, the storm I had unleashed began to spread. My phone buzzed with a notification, an anonymous message from one of Brian's co-workers. Hey, just thought you should know, the whole office is talking about Brian. Those pictures you sent? They are everywhere. He hasn't shown up today. HR is involved now. Thought you'd want an update. A grim smile crept across my face. The trap was working. Brian Keller's career was crumbling, and the worst was yet to come. But I wasn't done. His humiliation wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel the weight of his actions, to lose everything he'd taken for granted. And for that, I had one more play. I got into my car and drove to the address I'd pulled from Linda's emails. It was a small, unimpressive house in a quiet suburb. Jessica's car was in the driveway, a beat-up sedan that spoke of practicality over vanity. This wasn't about talking to her again, she'd already seen the evidence. This was about the final nail in Brian's coffin. I rang the doorbell and stepped back, my expression neutral. The door creaked open, and there she was. Jessica looked exhausted, her face pale, and her eyes rimmed red. She'd clearly spent the night crying, and I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy. "Michael," she said, her voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" "I came to check in," I said calmly. "I wanted to see if you're okay." Her lips quivered, and she stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. The house was modest, tidy, and unassuming. It was clear Jessica took pride in her home, something Brian had clearly taken for granted. She motioned for me to sit at the kitchen table and poured us both a cup of coffee. For a moment, we sat in silence, the tension between us heavy. "Why did you do this?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I set my cup down and leaned forward. "Because your husband thought he could waltz into my house, into my marriage, and disrespect me. He thought there would be no consequences." Her eyes flickered with anger, but not at me. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted. "He was distant, distracted. But I never thought," she trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "But you deserve better than someone who lies to you." She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she held her coffee mug. "What do you want from me?" I took a deep breath. "Nothing," I said. "But if you're serious about moving on from this, I suggest you start by making sure Brian pays for what is done. Don't let him weasel his way out of this. Make him face the consequences." Jessica looked at me, her jaw tightening. For the first time, I saw a spark of resolve in her eyes. "I will," she said. "He's not getting away with this." Satisfied, I stood up and headed for the door. "If you need anything, let me know," I said over my shoulder. "But don't let him manipulate you. He's not worth it." As I drove away, I knew I'd set the wheels in motion. Jessica wasn't the kind of woman to sit back and let things happen. She'd tear into Brian harder than I ever could. By the time I got back home, my phone was buzzing again. This time, it was Emily. "Dad," she said, her voice sharp. "Have you seen Mom's latest stunt?" "No," I replied, my tone flat. "What's she done now?" "She's posting on Facebook," Emily said, exasperated. "She's trying to paint you as some kind of monster. Talking about how you would cut her off and abandoned her after everything she's done for the family." I laughed darkly. "Of course she is. Let her play the victim. The truth is already out there. People are starting to comment," Emily continued. "Some of her friends are turning on her, but others are eating it up." "Don't waste your energy on her," I said. "She's desperate, and desperate people cling to whatever scraps of sympathy they can find. She'll burn herself out soon enough." Emily sighed. "Just don't let it get to you, okay?" "It won't," I said firmly. "I've got bigger things to focus on." After hanging up, I scrolled through Facebook to see Linda's post for myself. As expected, it was a mess of self-pity and manipulation. She talked about how she made a mistake and how she was being punished unfairly. The comments were a mix of sympathy and outrage, but it was clear her usual charm wasn't working as well as she hoped. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. The truth was already out, and no amount of crocodile tears would change that. The next day, I got another update from Brian's office. HR had called him in for a meeting, and he hadn't returned. Rumors were flying that he was being terminated. Jessica called me that evening, her voice stronger than before. "I kicked him out," she said simply. He came home begging for forgiveness, but I told him to pack his things. He's staying in some motel now. Good, I said. Don't let him worm his way back in. She laughed bitterly. Don't worry, I won't. He's dead to me. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of closure settling in. Brian was out of his house, out of his job, and out of excuses. Linda was floundering, grasping at whatever pity she could find. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the storm was finally clearing. But I wasn't done yet. There was one last move to make, one final act to ensure neither of them ever forgot who they'd crossed. The mornings felt different now. The house, once filled with subtle noises, Linda humming in the kitchen or the soft shuffle of her slippers, was now silent. It was the kind of quiet that should have been peaceful, but instead, it echoed like a reminder of the chaos she had unleashed. I poured myself a cup of coffee, letting the aroma fill the room as I leaned against the counter. The sunlight filtering through the blinds caught the edge of the folders on the table. Evidence, neatly organized, sat there like a loaded weapon waiting for the final pull of the trigger. This wasn't about anger anymore. Anger burns out. This was about precision. About ensuring neither Linda nor Brian could escape the consequences of their actions. I opened the folder and sifted through its contents again. Photos of their meetings, screenshots of their messages, records of financial transfers Linda had made to Brian's failing business. They had been sloppy, so caught up in their fantasy that they left a trail of destruction a mile wide. And now that trail was leading them straight into ruin. Later that morning, I drove to my lawyer's office. Tom was a man who rarely smiled, and today was no exception. He gestured for me to sit as he opened the folder I'd handed him during my last visit. This is a solid case, he said, flipping through the documents. The court won't have any sympathy for her. Adultery, misuse of joint finances, she'll walk away with little to nothing. That's a good start, I replied, keeping my tone steady. But it's not enough. Tom looked up, his curiosity piqued. What else are you aiming for? I want this to stick, I said. She doesn't just walk away broke. She walks away humiliated. I want everyone she knows to see what she's done. Same for him. Tom sat back in his chair, studying me. You realize that's going to burn every bridge they have, right? You're not leaving them with any way out. I nodded. They didn't leave me with a way out either. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out a USB drive and slid it across the table. This has everything. I want it sent to Brian's former employer, Linda's yoga group, and every relevant community board in town. I want their names to be tied to this mess permanently. Tom didn't hesitate. He nodded, pocketing the USB drive. Consider it done. By the time I got home, I could feel the tension in my shoulders starting to ease. It wasn't over yet, but the hardest parts were falling into place. Linda thought she could play the victim. She thought that a few tears and some well-placed lies could win her back the sympathy of her friends. She was wrong. Later that afternoon, I made a stop at Jessica's house. She answered the door quickly, her expression calmer than it had been during our first meeting. There was a quiet strength in her now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. Michael, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Her house was modest but warm, filled with small details that spoke of care and effort. Family photos lined the walls, and the kitchen smelled faintly of fresh coffee. We sat down at the table, and Jessica poured us each a cup. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. I wanted to thank you, she finally said, breaking the quiet. For telling me the truth. I needed to hear it, no matter how much it hurt. You deserve the truth, I replied. She nodded, her hands gripping the mug tightly. What happens now? That's up to you, I said. But if you want my advice, don't let him manipulate you. Men like Brian thrive on second chances they don't deserve. Her jaw tightened, and I could see the fire in her eyes. "He won't get one from me," she said firmly. We talked for a while longer, comparing notes on how Brian and Linda's betrayal had unfolded. By the time I left, I could tell that Jessica wasn't just ready to move on, she was ready to fight back. That evening, my phone buzzed with notifications. Tom had sent out the files, and the fallout was already starting. Messages began flooding in from old friends, neighbors, even distant family members. Everyone had the same questions. Is it true? Did Linda really? I didn't bother responding to most of them. The evidence spoke for itself, and I didn't feel the need to rehash the details. But I couldn't help scrolling through the local community board later that night, where the discussions had taken on a life of their own. Some posts defended Linda, clinging to the narrative she tried to spin about being a victim. But most were damning, tearing apart the lies she had used to build her image. Brian didn't escape the backlash either. Rumors about his failed business and his sudden firing spread quickly, painting a picture of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Linda tried to fight back. Her latest Facebook post was a mess of self-pity and deflection. She claimed she'd been pushed into a corner and accused me of being controlling. It was the same tired script I'd seen from people who couldn't own up to their actions. Her friends weren't buying it. The comments under her post ranged from lukewarm sympathy to outright condemnation. The cracks in her armor were widening, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. When Emily called that night, her voice was filled with disbelief. "Dad, you've really done it," she said. Mom's completely unraveled. No one's buying her story, and Brian's nowhere to be found. "Good," I replied simply. "She's lost everything," Emily continued. "Her friends, her reputation, she doesn't have anyone left." "She made her choices," I said. "Now she gets to live with them." After we hung up, I poured myself a drink and stepped out onto the porch. The street was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has passed. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. The envelope sat on the table like an unwelcome guest, its corners curling slightly in the morning humidity. I had no reason to open it, just another routine notice from the bank, the kind that would normally go straight into the trash. But today felt different. Something about seeing both our names printed neatly on the front, Michael and Linda West, tugged at me. It wasn't anger this time. Not even sadness. It was a kind of dull, detached curiosity, like staring at a scar that's long since stopped hurting but still serves as a reminder. I tore it open, skimming the contents without much thought. It was standard stuff, account balances, reminders about upcoming deadlines. And yet, as I read, I felt a decision forming, solid and certain, like the snap of a lock sliding into place. An hour later, I was sitting across from Harold at the bank. His office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of comforting, sterile scent that suggested permanence. Harold had always been polite, the kind of man who never raised his voice but still commanded respect. "Good morning, Mr. West," he said, adjusting his glasses as he opened his computer. "What can I help you with today?" "I need to make some changes to my accounts," I replied. He nodded, his hands already moving across the keyboard. "Of course. What sort of changes are we talking about?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Remove Linda West from everything. Accounts, investments, policies, if her name is on it, I want it gone." For a brief moment, Harold hesitated. It wasn't the kind of hesitation born of judgment, more like a quiet acknowledgement of the weight behind the request. "Understood," he said finally. "Let me update the records for you. This might take a few minutes." I watched as he worked, his fingers moving methodically across the keyboard. The silence in the room felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. It gave me time to think, to reflect on how many threads I'd had to untangle just to regain control over my own life. When Harold finally looked up, his expression was carefully neutral. "All done, Mr. West." Linda no longer has access to any of your accounts. I nodded, standing up. Thank you, Harold. He stood too, extending his hand. If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to reach out. As I left the bank, I felt a strange sense of finality. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It wasn't even relief. It was more like the quiet clarity that comes from knowing you've made the right choice, even if it doesn't feel like a victory. Later that afternoon, I found myself scrolling through the local community board. It had become something of a ritual over the past few days, a way to monitor the fallout without actively participating. The threads about Linda and Brian were still going strong. Some posts were scathing, dissecting every detail of their affair. Others were almost clinical, analyzing how people like them could betray their families so easily. One comment caught my attention. Spotted Brian at the Budget Inn by the highway. Looked like he hasn't slept in days. Karma's AB*******. I couldn't help but smile at that. Brian, who had strutted into my house so full of himself, now reduced to a cheap motel and borrowed dignity. And Linda wasn't doing much better. Her latest attempt at damage control, a rambling Facebook post about how nobody's perfect and how she was being unfairly punished, had only added fuel to the fire. You should have thought of that before you cheated, one comment read. Wow, Linda. Playing the victim card now? Classy, said another. I closed the app, not out of disinterest but because the outcome was already clear. Linda had always thrived on attention, but now it was turning on her. That evening, Emily called. Dad, have you seen Mom's Facebook meltdown? She asked, her voice tinged with both disbelief and amusement. I saw it, I replied. She called me earlier, Emily continued, the exasperation in her tone unmistakable. She's crying about how you've ruined her life, saying you're trying to destroy her reputation. I laughed quietly. She did that to herself. That's what I told her, Emily said. She hung up on me after that. I guess she didn't like hearing the truth. She never does, I said, leaning back in my chair. But it doesn't matter. People are starting to see her for who she really is. Emily paused, and I could hear the faint hum of traffic on her end of the line. Do you think she'll ever stop? Or is this just who she is now? She'll stop when she runs out of people to blame, I said. And judging by the way things are going, that won't take long. After we hung up, I poured myself a drink and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of grass and damp earth. It reminded me of the mornings I used to spend out here with Linda, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. That life felt like a different world now, one that belonged to someone else. For the first time in weeks, the weight in my chest began to lift. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no fireworks, no sweeping waves of relief. Just a quiet, steady realization I was finally free. The house felt different now, quieter in a way that didn't unsettle me as it once had. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty sink while the coffee maker hummed softly behind me. Mornings used to be filled with little rituals, Linda humming while she toasted bread, the faint sound of her slippers shuffling against the tile. Those small, ordinary noises had once seemed permanent, like the ticking of a clock you never really notice until it's gone. Now, the silence felt earned. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black as usual, and leaned against the counter. Outside, the oak tree in the yard was beginning to shed its leaves, little bursts of red and orange fluttering to the ground with every passing breeze. There was a calm to it, a rhythm I hadn't appreciated in years. The sound of my phone buzzing broke my thoughts. I reached for it, half expecting another update about Linda's latest stunt. But it was Tom, my lawyer. Morning, Michael, he said, his voice brisk but not hurried. Got some good news for you. I shifted the phone to my other ear, grabbing a chair at the table. Let me guess, Linda's finally waved the white flag? Tom chuckled. Close enough. her lawyer reached out late last night. She's accepted the divorce terms, no counteroffers. It's all in writing. I set my mug down, the sound of ceramic against wood sharper than I intended. She didn't fight it? Not a bit, Tom replied. Between the evidence we've got and her financial misuse, I think she knows she'd only make things worse for herself in court. She's letting it go. I exhaled slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was close. What about the house? I asked. Yours, Tom said firmly. She signed away any claim to it. It'll be finalized in the decree. For a moment, I didn't say anything. The house, with all its memories, both good and bad, was still mine. Despite everything, it felt like a victory. Thanks, Tom, I said finally. Let me know when it's all wrapped up. Will do. And Michael? Yeah? You handled this well. A lot of people would have let anger cloud their judgment, but you kept your head. I didn't answer. It wasn't about keeping my head, it was about doing what needed to be done. The rest of the day passed in a blur of small tasks. A run to the store for groceries. Fixing the latch on the backyard gate that had been sticking for months. Little things I'd put off, as if waiting for life to settle before tackling them. By mid-afternoon, I decided to check in with Jessica. She had been holding up surprisingly well considering the mess Brian had left behind, but I knew how easily people like him could worm their way back into someone's life. I dialed her number, and she answered quickly. Michael, she said, her voice lighter than I'd expected. Jessica, I replied. Just checking in. How are things? There was a pause, the kind where you can tell someone is choosing their words carefully. Better, she said eventually. Brian's been trying to call, leaving voicemails about how sorry he is. But I haven't responded. I'm not falling for it. Good, I said. You're doing the right thing. She laughed softly, a sound tinged with both gratitude and exhaustion. You make it sound easy. It's not, I admitted. But it's worth it. For a while, we talked about Brian, how his attempts to win her back were growing increasingly desperate. I could tell she was tired, but there was a quiet strength in her voice, the kind that comes from realizing you deserve better. If he keeps bothering you, let me know, I said before we hung up. There are ways to make him stop. Jessica hesitated, then laughed again, this time with more confidence. Thanks, Michael. But I think I've got this. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and leaves. The street was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets. I thought about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. Linda's betrayal, Brian's humiliation, the slow unraveling of the life we'd built together. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the lies, the disrespect, the audacity of thinking I would simply roll over and take it. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was Emily. Dad, she said, her tone both amused and exasperated. You're not going to believe this. Try me, I replied. Mom's moved in with one of her yoga friends, Emily said, barely containing her laughter. Apparently, she told them she needed a support after everything you've done to her. I let out a low chuckle. And let me guess, they're already regretting it? Oh, definitely, Emily said. One of them posted on the community board about how Linda's draining their energy and stirring up drama in the group. Sounds about right, I said. We talked for a while longer, the conversation drifting between Linda's antics and lighter topics. By the time we hung up, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the night sky. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like freedom. the house smelled different now. It wasn't something I could place right away, but it felt fresher, somehow. Like the air had finally cleared after months of feeling thick and oppressive. I stood by the open kitchen window, my coffee steaming on the counter behind me, and let the faint autumn breeze drift in. It carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and just a hint of the neighbor's wood-burning stove. This had become my favorite part of the day, early evening, when the light was soft, and the quiet of the house didn't feel so heavy. I turned back to the table where a small stack of papers sat waiting. They were the last remnants of everything that had happened, at the divorce settlement, the finalized court documents, and a single folder holding all the evidence I'd collected against Linda and Brian. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind flickering back to the night I had first discovered their betrayal. The anger I'd felt then had been so consuming, so sharp, it was hard to imagine it ever dulling. And yet, here I was, weeks later, feeling not anger but something closer to relief. The phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Emily. "Hey, Dad," she said when I answered, her voice warm. "How's it going?" "Quiet," I replied, glancing out the window again. "Just how I like it." She laughed softly, and for a moment, I could picture her sitting on her apartment couch, her legs curled up beneath her like she used to do as a teenager. "I figured you'd want to know," she said after a pause. "Mom's been calling me again." I let out a sigh, leaning back against the counter. "And?" "She's saying she wants to talk things through," Emily said, her tone tinged with exasperation. "That she deserves closure. Whatever that means." I chuckled dryly. "Closure?" She didn't seem too worried about that when she was sneaking around with Brian. "That's exactly what I told her," Emily said. "She didn't take it well. Started going on about how you've turned everyone against her." "Sounds like her," I muttered. There was a short silence before Emily spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Do you think she really believes that? That she's the victim in all of this?" "People like your mother," I said, choosing my words carefully, "don't see themselves the way the rest of us do. She's not sorry for what she did, she's sorry she got caught. Big difference." Emily sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "I guess I just don't get it. How someone could throw away everything you built together like that." "You and me both," I said simply. We talked for a little while longer, the conversation drifting toward easier topics. By the time we hung up, the sky outside had deepened into a rich indigo, and the first stars were starting to peek through. I carried the papers from the table into the study, a room that Linda had always dismissed as your little cave. She never understood why I loved it so much, the old leather chair in the corner, the faint smell of aged wood from the bookshelves, the way the late afternoon light always seemed to hit the desk just right. Now, it was mine completely. I sat down at the desk and began sorting through the files. Most of it was routine, bank statements, copies of old joint accounts I'd already closed, legal paperwork confirming the division of assets. But when I reached the final folder, I paused. It was the one I had put together the night everything fell apart. The photos of Linda and Brian, the screenshots of their messages, the receipts from their secret meetings. It was all still there, neatly organized, a damning reminder of how quickly trust could be shattered. I flipped through it slowly, each page stirring memories I had tried to suppress. The sickening feeling in my stomach when I first saw the messages on her laptop. The way my hands had trembled as I printed out the photos, my mind reeling from the betrayal. I stared at the folder for a long moment before standing up and heading to the backyard. The fire pit hadn't been used in years. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the logs stacked beside it were damp from the recent rain. But it didn't matter. I grabbed the lighter from my pocket, placed the folder on top of the wood, and struck a flame. The fire caught slowly at first, the edges of the paper curling into blackened ash. But as the flame spread, they grew brighter, consuming the documents with a quiet, crackling intensity. I stood there, watching as the evidence of Linda and Brian's betrayal turned to smoke and embers, the heat warming my face in the cool evening air. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden wave of relief, no overwhelming sense of closure. Just a quiet stillness, like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. When the last of the fire had died out, I turned and walked back to the porch. The whiskey sat untouched on the table, the ice long since melted. I picked up the glass, swirling the liquid slowly as I stared out at the yard. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt open, like a blank page waiting to be filled. I raised my glass to the stars, the faint glint of light reflecting in the amber liquid. To freedom, I said softly, letting the words linger in the still night air. And for the first time, I truly felt it.